At the end of episode 12, humanity regained something it thought it had lost. Not death, but the ability to choose it. Endings became intentional, meaning returned through limits. Time regained shape because it could be defined again. For a moment, the structure of life felt restored. But structure does not stop with time. It extends into memory. For most of human history, memory was not optional. It faded naturally, but it could not be selectively removed. The past accumulated, shaped identity, and followed each person forward whether they wanted it or not. Memory was weight. Memory was continuity. Memory was what made a life feel like a single unfolding experience. But once consciousness becomes editable, memory no longer needs to be carried. It can be stored. It can be accessed. And eventually, it can be removed. At first, the idea of removing a memory feels extreme. Memory is not just information. It is experience. It carries emotion, context, and consequence. It connects moments into something continuous, something that feels like a life. To remove a memory is not just to forget. It is to edit reality after it has already been lived. So the first removal is careful, deliberate. It is framed as relief. A single moment is selected something painful, disruptive, or unnecessary. A memory that no longer serves a purpose. The process is controlled, precise, and reversible in its earliest form. The result feels subtle. Nothing dramatic changes. The world remains intact. Identity appears stable. Only one piece is missing, a moment that once existed, now absent without trace. And that absence does not feel like loss. It feels like quiet. And once that quiet is experienced, the boundary that once protected memory begins to weaken. After the first memory is removed, the pattern becomes clear. People do not begin by erasing joy. They begin by removing pain. Trauma is softened, regret is reduced, embarrassment disappears. Moments that once triggered discomfort are identified, isolated, and quietly erased from active memory. The process is framed as refinement, a way to improve emotional stability without altering the present. And in many ways, it works. Emotional reactions become smoother. Internal conflict decreases. The past feels cleaner, less disruptive, easier to carry forward. Life becomes more manageable when the sharpest edges are removed. But pain was never random. It marked significance. It shaped caution. It defined contrast between moments. Without it, the past begins to lose structure. Experiences flatten. Emotional boundaries blur. The change is not immediately visible, but something subtle begins to disappear. Not suffering, but the depth that suffering once created. As more memories are edited, a pattern begins to emerge. Lives become cleaner. Painful moments are reduced. Regret is removed. Emotional spikes are softened or eliminated entirely. The past becomes easier to navigate, smoother, more consistent, less disruptive to the present. At first, this feels like improvement. Identity stabilizes. Internal conflict decreases. The narrative of a life becomes easier to understand when its most chaotic elements are gone. People begin to feel more in control of who they are. But something subtle begins to shift. Without contradiction, identity becomes simplified. Without tension, growth becomes harder to trace. The moments that once forced change, discomfort, failure, emotional rupture are no longer present to shape the person moving forward. The result is not emptiness. It is coherence. A life that feels complete, stable, and internally aligned, but also one that has been quietly edited into something smoother than it was ever lived. As memories are refined, something begins to fade. Not experience, contrast, For most of human history, emotion was defined by variation. Joy stood out because sadness existed. Relief mattered because tension preceded it. Meaning emerged from difference, from the distance between one state and another. But when pain is removed, that distance narrows. The emotional spectrum compresses. Highs feel less intense because lows are no longer present to define them. Moments remain positive, but they no longer feel exceptional. Stability increases, but variation decreases. At first, this feels like balance. Life becomes easier to maintain when emotional extremes are reduced. Reactions become predictable. Internal states remain steady across changing circumstances. But emotion was never only about stability. It was about contrast. And without contrast, something subtle begins to disappear. Not happiness, but the ability to feel how different happiness once was. As emotional contrast fades, connection begins to change. For most of human history, relationships were shaped by shared intensity. People bonded through struggle, conflict, vulnerability, and the unpredictable nature of experience. Connection was not just built on similarity, it was built on friction. But when memories are edited, that friction disappears. Conversations become smoother, interactions become easier. Conflict becomes rare, not because understanding has improved, but because the emotional triggers that once created tension are no longer present. At first, this feels like progress. Relationships stabilize, misunderstandings decrease, emotional volatility no longer disrupts connection. Everything feels more controlled, more manageable, more consistent. But something subtle begins to shift. Without tension, connection loses depth. Without vulnerability, understanding becomes surface level. People relate to each other more easily, but also more lightly. And slowly, without conflict or collapse, relationships begin to feel less like something lived, and more like something maintained. As memory becomes editable, identity begins to follow. At first, people remove isolated moments, then patterns, then entire categories of experience. Over time, the past is no longer something discovered, it becomes something arranged. And from arrangement, design emerges. People begin shaping their identities intentionally. They keep certain memories, remove others, highlight specific experiences while minimizing those that do not align with how they want to be perceived, both by others and by themselves. The result is not deception, it is curation, a version of the self that feels coherent, stable, and aligned with chosen values. Identity becomes less reactive, less accidental, more controlled. The randomness of lived experience gives way to something more deliberate. But something subtle changes in the process. The self is no longer something that unfolds. It becomes something that is assembled. Not everyone chooses to edit. As curated identities become more common, a minority begins to resist. They keep their memories intact not because it is easier, but because it is harder. They retain the moments others remove. The uncomfortable ones, the chaotic ones, the ones that do not fit cleanly into a stable narrative. To them, memory is not a problem to solve. It is the foundation of identity. They argue that pain was never an error, that contradiction was never a flaw, that the parts of life people now remove were the very things that once created depth, growth, and meaning. Their lives are less stable, their emotions less predictable, their relationships more complex, but also more intense, more grounded, more real in ways that are difficult to quantify. And as the rest of society moves toward refinement, those who refuse to forget begin to stand apart not as outdated, but as something increasingly rare. As memory editing spreads, it begins to scale beyond individuals. It becomes systemic. What starts as personal choice evolves into collective behavior. Entire institutions begin adapting to a world where memory is no longer fixed. Records are updated, histories are revised. Conflicts are softened or removed from shared narratives. At first, this feels like progress. Old grievances disappear, cultural tensions ease. The past becomes easier to manage when its most painful elements are no longer carried forward in full detail. Society becomes more stable, more cooperative, more aligned. But something begins to shift. History loses friction. Events remain, but their emotional weight is reduced. Lessons remain, but their urgency fades. The past becomes cleaner, but also less instructive. And over time, civilization itself begins to change. Not because it forgets entirely, but because it remembers selectively. As memory becomes editable, truth begins to fragment. For most of human history, reality was anchored by shared experience. Events could be debated, interpreted, and even distorted, but they were still rooted in something collectively remembered. The past, however imperfectly understood, remained a common reference point. But when memory can be altered, that reference dissolves. People begin carrying different versions of the same events. Entire experiences exist in multiple forms, adjusted, softened, or removed entirely, depending on who remembers them. Agreement becomes harder, not because of conflict, but because of divergence. At first, the difference feels subtle. Details don't align, perspectives shift, conversations lose precision. But over time, something deeper begins to break. Without shared memory, there is no shared past. And without a shared past, truth stops being something people discover together. It becomes something they each carry alone. As shared truth disappears, something even deeper begins to fade. Collective identity. For most of history, societies were held together not just by geography or systems, but by memory. Shared victories, shared losses, shared moments that defined what it meant to belong. These memories created continuity, a sense that individuals were part of something larger than themselves. But when memory becomes personal, identity follows. People no longer inherit the same past. Cultural reference points begin to drift. Events that once unified groups lose their emotional consistency. The stories that define nations, communities, and generations begin to fragment into variations. At first, this feels like diversity. More perspectives, more interpretations, more individual freedom in how the past is understood. But over time, cohesion weakens. Because identity was never built only on difference. It was built on shared meaning. And when meaning is no longer collective, belonging becomes unstable, no longer something reinforced by memory, but something each individual must define alone. In the end, forgetting is no longer accidental. It becomes intentional. Not a failure of memory, but a decision about what should remain. As societies gain the ability to edit, suppress, and reshape the past, forgetting transforms into a form of control, not over events, but over their meaning. Painful histories can be softened, divisions can be reduced, collective trauma can be managed, rather than carried forward, unchanged. The past becomes something adjustable, shaped to support stability instead of conflict. And in many ways, it works. Societies become calmer, more aligned, less burdened by the weight of what came before. But something else changes. Memory was never just a record. It was resistance. It held tension, it preserved contradiction, it forced confrontation with what could not be undone, and in doing so, it gave depth to progress. When forgetting becomes a choice, that resistance fades. The question is no longer what happened. It is what remains visible. Because a civilization that can choose what to remember must also decide what it is willing to lose.